what? We've got a lot to go through today, and I really want to have a good interactive discussion about this because there's a lot of different scenarios to consider today. So I'm so grateful for Phil coming in. I have been sending Phil all of the questions I get from people with regards to travel. He's so kind.
Do my best to try and answer. As you all know, it changes every 5 minutes. Read the policy. That will tell you right away.
And pay attention to the exclusion. But you know what? We've got a lot to go through today, and I really want to have a good interactive discussion about this because there's a lot of different scenarios to consider. But, Phil is my go-to for everything travel, and in the last little while, I've been picking his brain a lot as people come in with various questions, concerns, and travel issues.
You know, this is pretty kind of basic 101 for a broker, you know, selling, doesn't matter whether it's travel policies or life policies or whatever, which is, you know your product, know what is being sold, and certainly advise your clients that, you know, nothing is a guarantee. And certainly in this landscape, you know, what that's changing every 5 minutes, it seems, and somebody is coming up with something new, and the pandemic itself is ever shifting. That it's really tough. And so I think an ounce of caution and dare I say an ounce of common sense should prevail no matter what happens. You know, for clients who are traveling or anybody that wants to travel, is know what you need to know and know what you need to present to not only the airport authorities in your home country upon departure, but what you need to know coming back. You know, and have that fairly well documented, because it can become a bit overwhelming, and it can become confusing as to what's acceptable today may not be acceptable tomorrow. What wasn't acceptable may now be acceptable. You know, if you're going to the US, is it the same as going to the UK? Or is it the same going to New Zealand or to China, or for that matter? You know, you really have to rely that this is not just your own country you have to worry about. You have to worry about what's happening in that destination or destinations that you are going to, and how they are treating it, which vaccines they'll accept, which ones they won't. You know, what are the particular rules and requirements for travelers coming in, and they do differ all over the place. So, you know, a bit of research is going to probably save clients, you know, a whole lot of heartache at the end of the day. And then, you know, to address some of the questions about, you know, testing beforehand and what happens. I think, Lauren, you said, what happens if I get tested and I know, or I find out that I'm at the airport that I've tested positive? Well, you know, a quick read of your policy will tell you if you tested positive, if you have COVID coverage, if you tested positive prior to departure. It doesn't say within 10 minutes of departure. It says prior to departure, and that's very key. You know, just because you're at the airport doesn't mean that you departed.
Follow-up question to that, though, I think there's two parts to that question. Is if they test positive and they're at the airport and they've purchased cancellation insurance, is it too close to that time frame that they could actually apply to have that cancellation insurance pay out? Or is there an opportunity that they could refuse that because of the timeline? And the second part of that is, if you test positive and you know now your travel insurance is nullified, okay, that's fine. Can you still get on the plane? Honestly, well, getting that question.
Yeah, like, you know, and my response to that is no. Because again, it doesn't really, like most insurance contracts, it doesn't get really that specific. You know, to give you an example of one of the major players, their eligibility is you have not been diagnosed with COVID-19 on or within 30 days prior to departure. So that's fairly specific. On means the day of departure, or within 30 days means any time. So really they're covering themselves off. Again, going back to the first thing, 10 minutes before you are out to play on the plane is not specified in the contract. It says prior to departure. And I would hang my hat with the insurance company, as much to my chagrin that I don't always agree with insurers, that I would say, you know what, they're right. It didn't say if you're at the airport and you receive a diagnosis, we will allow you to get on the plane. If that was their intent, they would have written it that way.
So Phil, I'm a lawyer, so this is just making me think, oh, does that mean I should just turn my phone off so I don't get any messages before I depart?
I don't
Because then
know.
I haven't received a diagnosis.
Yeah. You're a lawyer, and I would hate to debate anything legal with a lawyer, but I would say ignorance is not a defense.
Right.
You know, you kind of were, just because you didn't turn on your cell phone, and you, because you didn't want to know. I guess anybody would say, well, you had the test and you didn't have the results, and you knew you were going to probably get them, so you shut the phone off just in case. I don't know. I don't think that's a valid argument, and one that would be defensible by anybody.
So does it talk about receiving a diagnosis, or does it talk about like being diagnosed, right?
It says have not been diagnosed. And again, you know, right. I guess we could get into the splitting of hairs of what does receiving mean, or what does being diagnosed, you know.
Right.
You can have an argument either way. And I guess I would look at saying, you know, just because you haven't received it, the wording here, it says have not been diagnosed. You have been diagnosed. You just don't know about it yet, or didn't
right.
want to know about
right.
it. That doesn't take away from the fact that you were diagnosed prior to departure.
Right. Interesting hair splitting though, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, one could validly argue that, but, you know, I like to say, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say, well, that's not what the words say.
Well,
so, you know,
we look at the policy even before COVID. So all of us in the room are used to looking at those wordings. The policy itself has always been on the side of vague. You know, I have had situations where people have made claims out of country, and portions of that claim, I had one that actually still makes me laugh to this day, was a broken leg. So everything on that broken leg was covered except anything pertaining to the ankle. I know, Claudia, I honestly, and we fought that for months going, where in the policy is it telling me that a broken leg doesn't include an ankle? You know, but so that's the minutia that was happening prior to COVID. Now we have the additional minutia that is not very clear in these policies. Yeah. And, you know, that's what I think makes.
Well, the reality is, I don't think that we're going to change the insurance industry and the way that they do put some of these exclusions in, and they are typically meant to be, you know, vague to a certain extent to allow insurers, I think, the ability to contest claims that maybe they think may have been filed surreptitiously or knowingly, that you know, I'll see what I can get away with. You know, I do have faith in the insurance companies that for the most part they act in good faith and they pay all reasonable claims, you know, that are presented to them, and in some cases, some, you know, that are kind of along that very gray area, just for the sake of paying them, and it's not worth fighting them. But, you know, I think there's a responsibility on us and as brokers, and certainly on clients, to tell them, to say, you know, definitively, no. You know, if you've been diagnosed or you've had symptoms or whatnot, according to the contract, specifically related to COVID, I would not get on that plane. And if you lied about it and went down there and ultimately got sick and required hospitalization, I would say the insurance company is not going to pay your claim. You know, so,
I have a question about destination countries. Are there destination countries that are on like a blacklist, like relating to COVID, like we won't provide any health coverage if you go to this country or that country, or?
I would have to research that, but I do know that the UK has specific countries. I don't know if Canada and the US have followed suit, but the UK has a specific listing of countries or COVID excluded countries. I would not surprise me if there is a list somewhere. And again, it may be the Canadian government's listing. So you'll see in a lot of cases that insurers will defer to, we won't pay any claims, or you've traveled against the advice of the government, the particular government agency in charge of it, or has, they have travel advisories that have been issued by your government. So that, again, there's that vague wording that nobody says, well, I better go check the Canadian travel advisory website to see exactly how that affects us. Well, that's how the insurance industry would get around certain things, is by having that wording. It's quite specific, but it's quite vague. And when was the last time that you sold a travel policy to a client that client went to the Canadian government website and looked up the travel advisories? I would hazard a guess, maybe a small percentage did it, but 98, 99% would say, okay, fair enough, I'm going.
So one of my conversations this morning was with somebody who just got back from Europe. You'd be happy to know this, Patty. And then I had another one from a fellow just back from the Bahamas. And in both of those situations, they had really good experiences. They said the way that other countries are handling it seem very streamlined, where the coming back into Canada creates more of that hassle. We said, pack a carry-on of patients. They said the coming back to Canada was more onerous than the leaving, and that most European countries, they have it down. They know what they're doing. They know how to get their tourists in motion and enjoying their stay. That leads to another question that somebody had pre-sent me in, which was, with the PCR test when you're coming home and you're flying, is it good enough? Do you have to have that PCR test, or can you just show, that you've been vaccinated and you're just returning home? What do you hear on that front?
My understanding is that they still require confirmation of the testing coming back within 3 days, a valid test within the past 3 days, to the best of my knowledge. So that hasn't gone away. So not only do you have to have proof of vaccination, but you also have to have proof that you've got a negative test. Right? Because realistically, having your vaccination doesn't preclude you from ever getting a diagnosis of COVID. It precludes you probably from getting very sick or dying, but it doesn't preclude you from getting it. So my understanding is you still have to have both. So again, it comes back down to, if you're going down, do I meet the requirements going down? And by the way, Laura, I would agree with you. I've heard of more issues coming back to Canada than leaving Canada, which is kind of very typical. It's kind of like even before going through customs. Going through customs in most other countries is relatively easy. Oh, you're Canadian coming back into your home country, and you feel like a criminal. It's absolutely terrible. So, nothing has really changed in that. It's just what they're keying in on now. So you really do have to follow the rules, and you do really have to keep on top of it if you're going. And take all reasonable precautions. And that does, just because you got out of the country and you knew at that time what the rule is, you're still going to have to figure out, if you're going on a 30-day vacation. Well, 30 days is a long time in this world right now. You need to figure out, what was my latest rule, and keep abreast of what's happening, in the world at large while you're traveling, as it pertains to coming back. The responsibility really is, in my mind, up to you to figure that out.
No, I was just actually going to say a footnote to that. We actually had one of our staff that had gone to Texas for the week, and like I mentioned, we were in a sales meeting this week. So she came back from Texas yesterday. Prior to going, she had to have the COVID testing, and then coming back, she had to have the testing before getting back into the country for the one within I think it's like 48 hours, the rapid testing, and she had to purchase it on her own. So both tests were done, but she had to pay for at the border as well.
That, and you can't claim it through the benefit plan. What happens, and I'm pretty vague on this too, what happens if you test positive coming back in? Do you have to stay on vacation, or like what happens there?
Yeah, you have to stay, right, and quarantine for the 10 days, right? So, and I know we just went over this yesterday, and I can share this with you guys afterwards, but one of our travel medical insurance providers, like I'm looking at it right now, and it's just, what's included, right? So emergency medical insurance, it says government mandated COVID tests. Is it covered or not covered, right? So
a lot of complaints about that.
Yeah. And then because there's vaccinated plans and then unvaccinated plans, which is interesting. I was going to question Phil about was that, so we're in Vancouver, so very close to the border. And so I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day who he owns a seasonal property down in just in Washington, just a hop, skip, and a jump over the border, which he obviously hasn't been able to go to for almost 2 years now. And now that the land borders are opening, he wants to just pop down there and check on his property. But you have to have that negative COVID within 3 days. So can he get it here on Friday and then go down and come back on Sunday and show that? Or does he need to get another one while he's down there on Sunday? And I said, well, if you read it, I read it that it's within 3 days. So I think that one to go down and come back is okay. But there's no really, like what you said, Phil, like the wordings, like they're vague, right? They could be left up to interpretation, right? So so he's like, I don't know if we should, but it's expensive to get those tests. It's $200, right? So he's like, and he's got a family of 4. He's like, do we just do it once and chance it, or do we just shell out the extra $600 to get everyone tested?
Yeah, I think, Natasha, you're right. I mean, it is vague, and if it was kind of Vancouver to Washington and back within 24 hours or 48, one could argue and say, well, no, it's within the 3 days.
Yeah.
Personally, I think the intent of the insurers and the intent of the policy is to say you have to have one when you depart within a specific period of time, and coming back, you have to have a specific one. That's the conservative view, and I think that's what the intent is. Yeah. But it's not specifically stating that.
Yeah.
So again, if you want to roll the dice and argue that, you could. You may want to ask them to say, okay, do I need one coming and going? Yeah. And certainly get it documented if possible, or at least say, I spoke to Phil at ABC Insurance Company. Yeah. Specifically asked him, and he told me this, and I wrote it, and I spoke to him on this date, and he said it was all okay. You could do that, but I think in my mind, it's clearly meant one departing, one coming back. The magic thing is you cross the border.
Yeah. I'm going to share that with him, because I liked your word intent, right? So, what is their intent? And I think that's poignant to keep in mind when we're thinking about the vagueness of the policies and the wordings.
Well, and one of the online debates right now with the snowbirds is the point that to come back into Canada, you have to do an asymptomatic test. But if you're in Canada and you are a close contact of an actual positive COVID case and you're asymptomatic, you can't get a test. So there's this big disconnect between the testing metrics. And so snowbirds are kind of pushing back on that. And because of the cost, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how long they keep that going, because, it's going to make travel, the old, family once in a lifetime trip to Disneyland. Well, that's now off the table, because to get $2,000 worth of COVID tests is just not even happen, right?
I wanted to also share, I'm reading on this thing right now. It leads to what Lori was talking about. Quarantine expenses for accommodation and meals is covered. So if you do have to quarantine, that's covered, which I think is quite interesting.
Timeline to me is always, so like we talked about this last year, Phil, we talked about it throughout the year. I can't seem to wrap my head around timeline. and call me thick, that's okay, because you can have a test. So we get to the airport, and when we have a negative COVID test. So the four of us get on the plane, and yeah, money there, Patty, you're absolutely right. We could buy an extra plane ticket for the testing there and coming back, never mind the exchange rate on the dollar. But so we're there and we have a negative COVID test and we go. And our vacation's only 2 weeks. So we know that the incubation period is that 10 to 14 days. I'm 1 week into my holiday and I get COVID. I'm thinking I took it with me. So now I'm a pre-existing, despite, I know we've talked about this, Phil, despite having that negative test, can they say it was a false negative, that because I'm within the incubation period, that I took it with me and now I'm a pre-existing?
Well, again, I think the argument is the insurance company set the rule, and the government set the parameters for you to have it. And the parameter was, you can't have had any symptoms. You've had to have tested negative. And if you met 100% of those specific items, then you've passed the test. Didn't have any symptoms. I tested negative. I was allowed to go. I met all the qualifications for actually leaving the country. Now coming back, and you're right, okay, a week into it, now I'm testing positive. Well, I think the insurer would have a tough time saying, well, that's a pre-existing condition because you were in there. No, by anybody's rights, you tested negative, you had no symptoms. Yeah, unfortunately, that's the way illnesses work. 1 minute you have it, next minute you don't, or vice versa. So I think the insurer would be hard pressed to say, yeah, we're not paying for that because it's pre-existing and you weren't stable or whatnot. Or you can actually turn that around if they tried to use a stability clause and said, well, yeah, actually I had no negative, I had no symptoms and I tested negative. So I was pretty stable, by their own accord. So, but coming back, that's qualifying for getting your expenses paid for, and I think, we talked about this now earlier on, whereas I think COVID is starting to be seen as any other illness or disease that was kind of contracted prior to or whatnot. And I think you'll see this kind of start to lose its luster as they gain more experience and this goes on for a longer and longer period of time, which in my mind, I think it will. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it, period. It's here to stay.
And that stability clause is still really important to remember. So you could have somebody who thinks they're planning to travel, say in 2022. So they're planning to travel in January and they get COVID in November. Okay. And then they're good, right? They got it. They're all good. They go through Christmas and they don't have any symptoms. You still have to check that stability clause. Is it a 30 day? Is it a 60 day?
I think the bigger issue is going to be with the so-called folks that kind of get this long COVID, where it seems to drag on for months and months and months. At least that's what we're seeing now. That to me is going to be a bigger issue for those folks than kind of your run-of-the-mill, I got it, as you say, I had it, I'm over it, now I test negative, I don't have any other symptoms. Now, again, you have to rely on that wording to say, okay, was it reasonable? If they ask you, have you had COVID? Yes. When did you have it? Yes. Are you negative now? Yes. When was your last test this time? Do you exhibit any symptoms? No. So, again, I think everybody's condition and how they answer those questions is going to be kind of unique to them, as to how they answer them. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of clear-cut answers on some of this stuff, certainly with those people that have long COVID, where they're still exhibiting symptoms and whatnot. One could argue, well, you're not, symptom-free. You have been.
I have a question about sort of a technicality. Again, it's the lawyer in me coming out, forgive me. So it's a 72-hour requirement, but from when? What if your flight is delayed? And now your test is 75 hours ago. Now, are you denied boarding the plane?
I mean, that's a good question. I think, somebody standing at the gate in that situation would have to be fairly technical and proficient at what they're looking at. And, I think if you got up there and you presented all of the documents and you pass the test, and all of a sudden, plane gets delayed, and you go through that and you're presenting the same documentation, I'm not entirely sure everybody would say, whoops, sorry, time's expired, and so you can't get on. Having said that, I can also imagine that probably there is somebody out there that actually would do it. It would not surprise me, but I don't think the vast majority would in that particular instance with a delayed flight. But again, technically, I'm going to
go for the 48-hour notice.
Yeah.
See if I can get in 2 days. So I've got a whole day of grace there.
Yeah.
Remove that risk, right?
Well, you bring up a good example, Patty. I know that we were set to fly out. Our original, what we booked and paid for was at 8 o'clock in the morning. Okay, that's when we were flying out. Our latest update, and they seem to send them all the time, we're now not flying out till 3:30 in the afternoon. That's quite a difference between what we purchased and what we're going to end up with. So you make a really good point on delays.
I think it's very interesting, a very interesting time. And I think if you know ahead that they're going, and, if you're waiting to get your test, you're probably best to wait to, one of the last possible moments to get that test.
I think
not too long that you're not going to get the results in time, but long enough that perhaps with the scenario Patty spells out, we'll cover that off.
Oh, for sure. I think too, you bring up a good point about the insurers. I haven't heard anything now, and you may have. So if you have, I haven't heard of the insurers not stepping up to cover those claims. So when there have been people, I'm not hearing anything, and we would, right? It would be all over the media if people were making a travel claim and that's been declined for the types of situations that we're outlining here. So I'm not hearing anything come back. Are you hearing anything, Phil?
Not really. No, not at all. And again, people being people, if they were honestly, done hard by the insurance industry, you'd see it on the evening news very, very, very quickly. I mean, the ones you always see on the news, typically once you get beyond, the news flash and start peeling back those layers, and Patty, you as a lawyer would really understand this, the reality is quite different than what's presented publicly. It's like, well, sir, you said you didn't have a heart problem, but you were suffering a heart attack as you got on the plane. You knew that. You got the doctor right beside you. They were administering an IV. What were you thinking?
Well,
it's usually fairly obvious that somebody is trying to game the system on that.
Well, and the insurers right now stand to benefit from a lot of travel policies. So, paying out the odd bogus claim now and then just to keep them out of the media and keep them from being accused of being a negative, not helpful. I mean, travel insurance is going to be huge over the next couple of years as everybody gets in those vacations that we postponed, right? So,
yeah.
I agree with you, Patty. I think it's an opportunity for them to step up and say, if we're going to offer the coverage, we're going to honor the coverage.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I mean, you want to take the risk, charge the premium accordingly. I mean, the snowbirds have always been an interesting kind of segment of the population as it pertains to healthcare, because they're arguably the highest risk category of people going to the highest cost center in the world. It's like the perfect tsunami that's coming together, and you're bound to see bad things happen. I mean, people who are in their 80s and whatnot, and they're saying, well, I'm healthy, and you may be, but You know, you're going to a place that boy, if you have appendicitis, you know, 2 days in the hospital is going to hit you 50 grand. You know, without blinking an eye. You know, forget having a heart attack and being down in an ICU unit for the next 7 days, or open heart surgery. Well, trust me, if you don't have insurance for that, that's going to bankrupt you instantaneously. You know, people don't realize that, you know, they don't understand that going to the US is way, way, way riskier than perhaps going to any other country in the world from a financial point of view. It is that costly.
I never forget the example of I had a client that was in Vegas and they were seeing motocross races, and something flew into his eye and he couldn't flush it out himself. So he went to whatever medical place to have his eye flushed. $10,000.
Yeah.
That's burned into my head.
It's and the reality is most of, you know, the Canadians going down to the US are going to the very expensive places. You know, they want to go into California or Arizona or Florida. Well, I mean, California is expensive. And if you're going to Florida, it's off the charts what they charge down there. So, you know, people just don't realize that, you know, everything down in the States is from $1. There is no social safety net down there. You know, I mean, we could spend the next 20 years talking about what Obamacare had wanted and what its intent was, and was it successful, and, you know, how does it look now? I mean, the U.S. kind of first venture into socialized Medicare. And people complain, well, I can't get my treatment up here. I got to wait 6 months. Yeah, you know, I can get it down in the States. Sure you can. It's going to cost you $100,000. But yeah, you can get it tomorrow if you want. You know, that's the trade-off. You know, and being in an industry that's dealt with a lot of people in the U.S., I would not trade our system, its warts and all, for their system on any day of the week.
No. Thanks so much for coming by, Natasha. It was great to see you. On that Florida note, you know, it is the 50th anniversary of the opening of Walt Disney World this year. So this has been fantastic, Phil. Thank you so much for
my pleasure.
Time. Thanks so much for coming in. Great
Thanks
to see
very
you,
much.
Patty. She's going to wear the sombreros.
Enjoy.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
You guys have a great day too.